What draws us to a place we do not understand? Not simply beauty, not danger either. Something quieter than that, a pull we feel when the world stops behaving the way we expect, and a familiar landscape begins to look like a question. Across the earth, there are locations that seem to resist easy explanation. A river vanishes into stone as if the land itself were breathing. Light flashes over dark water with such persistence it feels almost ceremonial. Vast markings rest in a desert plain, so large they make sense only from a height their makers could never inhabit. These places are not fantasy. They are part of the real world, mapped and photographed, visited and measured, and yet they remain strangely unfinished in the human mind. We often speak of knowledge as if it were a brightening horizon, as if each new instrument and equation pulls another shadow out of the world. Much of the time, that is true. Science gives shape to mystery. History restores voices to silence. But every so often, discovery does something more unsettling. It reveals not certainty, but depth. The closer we look, the more layers we find beneath the answer we thought we wanted. This is a journey through 10 such places, not to prove the impossible and not to dress uncertainty in superstition, but to sit for a moment with the rare and humbling fact that reality is still larger than our explanations. Each place in this story offers evidence of something deeply human. Our need to name, to trace, to understand, and also our need to admit when understanding has not yet arrived. So begin with this thought. Perhaps mystery is not the failure of knowledge. Perhaps it is the beginning of attention. And perhaps the strangest places on earth are not hiding from us at all. Perhaps they are simply waiting for us to learn how to see. How can fire survive where water never stops falling? In a wooded corner of western New York, beneath the soft noise of a modest waterfall, a small flame answers that question by refusing to go out. You reach it by following a trail through Chestnut Ridge Park, where the trees thin and the sound of rushing water gathers ahead of you. The falls themselves are not enormous. They do not announce grandeur. But behind the curtain of water, tucked into a shallow grotto of dark stone, a flicker of orange light appears where no flame should reasonably live. It glows against wet rock. It trembles in the spray. And for a moment, the eye distrusts what it sees. The flame is fed by natural gas escaping through a crack in the shale. That much is known. Methane rises from below, and under the right conditions, it can burn for long periods, even in such an unlikely setting. Hikers sometimes relight it after wind or runoff smothers it. The wonder is not that a flame can exist there once. The wonder is that the geology beneath it seems to resist the explanation we would normally give. In most places, methane seeps like this are linked to underground heat, pressure, and the long transformation of ancient organic material. Here, the rock appears cooler than expected, the chemistry less straightforward, the source more elusive. Researchers have studied the site and found that the gas does not neatly fit the standard models. The fire is real, the seep is real, yet the process beneath them remains oddly out of tune with what the textbooks would predict. And so the little flame keeps burning in its pocket of mist, as though water and fire had negotiated a private peace. It feels ancient, though it is renewed again and again. A small exception in the logic of the landscape. Maybe that is why people linger there longer than they planned. Not because the mystery is enormous, but because it is intimate. It asks a simple question in a quiet voice. How much of the world do we overlook because we assume the elements already know their roles? What does it mean when even stone refuses to stay still? In Death Valley, where the ground seems emptied of motion and mercy, the answer arrives not with spectacle, but with a trail. Racetrack Playa lies flat beneath a wide Nevada sky, a dry lake bed so still it feels abandoned by time. The mud hardens into pale, cracked plates. Mountains rise at the edge like distant witnesses. And scattered across that open surface are rocks of different sizes, some modest, some heavy enough to test a person's strength. Behind many of them stretch long grooves in the earth, as if the stones had quietly chosen a direction and gone there on their own. For decades, nobody saw them move. That was the detail that kept the mystery alive. The tracks were undeniable. They curved, crossed, doubled back, sometimes running parallel as though the rocks had traveled in company, then separating without warning. Visitors arrived hoping to catch the moment. Researchers placed instruments, cameras, and sensors across the playa. Seasons passed. The stones remained still, preserving their secret by doing almost nothing at all. When an explanation finally came, it did not diminish the wonder. On rare winter nights, a thin sheet of water settles over the playa and freezes into delicate panes of ice. By morning, sunlight begins to loosen them. A light wind nudges the floating panels, and the panels, in turn, press against the rocks, sliding them inch by inch across the slick mud. The movement is so slow a person might stand nearby and never notice it. Mystery, in this case, was not magic. It was patience. And yet even solved mysteries leave behind a residue of feeling. The rocks still appear to act with intention. Their paths still look like handwriting from a mind we do not possess. We want movement to announce itself, to be dramatic enough for our eyes. But the world often works in quieter ways, through forces so small and brief they become visible only after they are gone. Perhaps that is the deeper lesson of the playa. Not that stones can move, but that reality does not need an audience to make something extraordinary happen. Where does a river go when the earth refuses to return it? In northern Minnesota, among pines, basalt, and the cold pull of Lake Superior, that question opens in the rock like a mouth. The Brule River moves with purpose through Judge C.R. Magny State Park, gathering speed as it approaches a dramatic split in the stone. One branch continues in plain sight, spilling down a familiar waterfall and carrying on its way. The other veers left into a deep circular hole carved into dark rock. It drops out of view with startling confidence, as though entering a passage the land has kept hidden from every map. For generations, people have stood at the edge of this opening, listening to the roar, and waiting for proof of what seems obvious. Water cannot simply disappear. It must emerge somewhere. It must rejoin the river below or find some concealed route to the lake. And yet the mystery of Devil's Kettle endured because the usual methods of tracing that journey led only to silence. Dye seemed to vanish. Objects tossed into the hole were not seen again. The river offered clues, but never a full confession. The place invites dramatic speculation, but its real power lies in something simpler. It exposes the limits of observation. We trust continuity. We trust that what enters a system will leave a mark we can follow. But underground, water becomes secretive. It exploits cracks too narrow for sight, descends through fractures shaped over ages, and moves through pressure and darkness without concern for human curiosity. The answer may be geological, even ordinary in principle. Yet the experience of standing there does not feel ordinary at all. The kettle seems less like a puzzle than a threshold. One side of the river remains in the world we can describe. The other passes into a hidden architecture beneath our feet, where stone and water continue their negotiations without witnesses. That may be why the place lingers in memory, not because it proves anything supernatural, but because it reminds us how much of the planet is still happening out of view. We call it disappearance when perhaps it is only passage. Still, for the one watching from above, the feeling is the same. Half the river is gone and the earth will not yet say where. Can a stone be split so perfectly that nature itself begins to look deliberate? In the desert of northwestern Saudi Arabia, one towering boulder poses that question in silence. It stands near the oasis landscape of Tama, rising from the sand with the poise of a monument. From a distance, Naslaa appears improbable enough. Up close, it becomes almost unnerving. A massive sandstone formation has been divided by a narrow vertical seam so straight and clean that it resembles a cut more than a fracture. The two halves face each other with astonishing balance, each resting on its own natural pedestal, as if the rock had been separated with care and then left in place for centuries to make a point. Desert light sharpens the illusion. At dawn and dusk, the edges seem almost too precise to belong to erosion. Ancient petroglyphs on the surface deepen the sense of time, suggesting that long before modern travelers arrived with cameras and questions, human beings were already standing here looking up and wondering what force had done this. The rock may have been meaningful even then, not because anyone understood it fully, but because its shape refused to feel accidental. Geologists offer sober explanations. Sandstone fractures along lines of weakness. Wind, temperature changes, and gradual weathering widen cracks over immense spans of time. Water may once have entered a fault, then expanded and weakened the stone season by season. These explanations are plausible. They belong to the logic of the desert. And yet plausibility is not always emotionally satisfying. The mind keeps returning to the seam itself, to its composure, to the almost architectural calm of the split. What unsettles us is not that nature can make strange things. We know it can. It is that nature sometimes creates forms so exact they resemble intention. And in doing so, it brushes against one of our oldest habits, the urge to see design wherever precision appears. Perhaps Naslaa endures in the imagination because it lives at that boundary. It is almost certainly natural, and still it feels authored. A reminder that the world can produce shapes beyond our expectations, and that sometimes the line between geology and symbol is thinner than it seems. We look at the stone and ask how it was divided. But beneath that question is another one, quieter and more human. Why does perfection make us feel watched? What kind of light appears without invitation, lingers without warning, and leaves without a name? In a narrow valley in central Norway, the night has been asking that question for decades. The Hessdalen Valley does not look like the setting for a modern mystery. It is quiet country, framed by dark slopes and long winters, a place where silence gathers early and the sky feels close enough to study. Yet since the early 1980s, strange luminous objects have appeared there with a regularity that transformed local rumor into international curiosity. They hover above the valley floor. They drift, pulse, divide, and sometimes accelerate in ways that resist ordinary comparison. Some glow white, others lean yellow, blue, or red. They are not constant, but they are persistent. Witnesses describe them first with the uncertainty people use when language runs behind experience. Then came the instruments. Cameras recorded them, radar tracked them. Spectral measurements confirmed that these were not tricks of vision or simple reflections from distant headlights. Whatever the lights were, they occupied space. They emitted energy. They belonged to the physical world, and still they resisted a stable explanation. Researchers proposed possibilities grounded in the valley itself. Metallic minerals in the surrounding terrain might interact with moisture, air, and temperature to produce luminous plasma. Electrical stresses in the bedrock might generate rare atmospheric effects. Some suggested that the valley behaves like a natural laboratory, where geology and weather combine to create events so unusual they appear almost intentional. Each theory illuminated part of the pattern. None fully dissolved the mystery. And so Hessdalen became a place where science did not retreat from wonder, but moved closer to it. Observation stations were built, data accumulated. The lights continued, indifferent to the categories waiting for them. This is what makes the valley so compelling. Not because it invites fantasy, but because it demonstrates that mystery can survive measurement. We tend to imagine that once something is recorded, it becomes understood. But understanding is slower than evidence. Sometimes the camera arrives before the concept. Sometimes the world reveals a phenomenon before we have the language to hold it. So the valley waits each night beneath its dark Scandinavian sky, and people still gather there, watching for another brief signature in the air. Not to witness the impossible, but to witness the unfinished. And perhaps that is more haunting still. What does a storm become when it returns so often that it feels less like weather and more like memory? Over the waters of Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela, night after night, the sky offers an answer in light. The phenomenon is known as Catatumbo lightning, named for the river that feeds the lake's southwestern edge. To witness it from a distance is to see the horizon pulse, as if some enormous heart were beating behind the clouds. The flashes come in clusters, then in waves, sometimes for hours at a time. They illuminate the air without fully revealing it. The lake, the mountains, the low clouds, all appear and vanish in fragments, as though the world were being developed in a darkroom, one exposure at a time. For centuries, sailors used this recurring brilliance as a point of orientation, a natural beacon visible from far out at sea. That may be the most extraordinary detail of all. This is not merely lightning that happens to strike often. It is a pattern so enduring that human beings learn to rely on it. Entire generations came to know that, in this place, darkness was rarely complete. Science has traced part of the mechanism. Warm, moisture-laden air rises from the Caribbean basin and the lake's broad surface. Cooler air descends from the surrounding Andes. The geography funnels wind and heat into a repeated atmospheric collision, building electrical charge with unusual efficiency. The explanation is persuasive, but like many good explanations, it clarifies the process without draining the wonder. Why here with such intensity? Why with such consistency? Why this choreography of air, water, heat, and terrain, repeated across years as though the land itself had learned a ritual? Standing beneath such a sky, a person feels both informed and small. We can model pressure, measure humidity, predict probabilities. Yet a storm like this still exceeds its diagram. It belongs not only to meteorology, but to experience. It reminds us that nature does not need rarity to inspire awe. Repetition can be just as profound. Perhaps that is why Catatumbo lightning endures in the imagination. It is not a single dramatic event, but a conversation between earth and atmosphere that has gone on longer than memory can comfortably hold. A storm that keeps returning, asking the same question in flashes across the dark. How many times can the world repeat its wonder before we stop calling it miraculous? Why do some places gather stories of disappearance the way coastlines gather fog? In the Western Pacific, there is a stretch of ocean where that question has lingered for generations, carried in the wake of ships that never returned. It lies in the waters associated with Japan's so-called Devil's Sea, a region whose boundaries shift depending on who is telling the story, but whose reputation remains remarkably consistent. Sailors have long described it as a place where compasses falter, weather changes with unsettling speed, and the horizon can turn from calm to hostile before a crew has time to understand what it is seeing. It is the kind of place where absence becomes its own kind of evidence. No dramatic final message, no confirmed wreckage, just an interruption, and then silence. Such places invite myth almost automatically. The human mind does not tolerate vanishing well. When something is lost without explanation, imagination moves in to complete the scene. But the Pacific does not need embellishment to be formidable. These waters sit near deep ocean trenches, seismically active zones, and undersea volcanic systems that make the region one of the most unstable environments on Earth. Methane releases from the seabed, rogue waves born from intersecting currents, sudden storms, and magnetic irregularities have all been proposed as partial explanations for the reports that made the area infamous. Each theory makes sense on its own. Together, they describe an ocean that is dynamic, violent, and imperfectly understood. That may be enough. Yet what keeps the Devil's Sea alive in the imagination is not simply danger. It is uncertainty layered over danger, the unsettling possibility that even with charts, satellites, and modern instruments, the sea can still erase a human story with terrifying efficiency. We like to think of oceans as surfaces to be crossed, routes between one certainty and another. But beneath every voyage is an older truth. The sea is not a road. It is a living system of depth, pressure, motion, and indifference. It does not keep human records. It does not explain itself. Perhaps that is why this region remains so haunting. Not because it proves anything supernatural, but because it restores an ancient perspective. For all our technology, there are still places where the world reminds us that being lost is one of the oldest human experiences, and the water has not forgotten how to make it happen. What happens to a landscape when even silence begins to feel active? In the desert of northern Mexico, there is a place where absence has earned a name. It is called the Zone of Silence, a remote region in the Mapimi area of Durango, where stories of failed radio transmissions and erratic instruments have circulated for decades. The desert itself appears almost austere in its simplicity: low shrubs, dry air, long sightlines. A horizon that feels less like an edge than a suspension. Nothing in the terrain suggests interference, and yet that is precisely what drew people there. The claim that signals weaken, compasses behave strangely, and communication becomes unreliable in ways that do not fully conform to expectation. Like many famous mysteries, the Zone of Silence lives at the crossroads of report, exaggeration, and genuine environmental peculiarity. Part of its reputation grew after a missile test in 1970, when an American rocket veered off course and landed in the region, bringing unusual international attention to an area that might otherwise have remained a local curiosity. From there, the desert entered a new life in the public imagination. Scientists, journalists, mystics, and travelers all arrived, each looking for a different version of the truth. Geology offers one possible foundation. The region contains unusual mineral concentrations, and certain materials in the soil may affect radio propagation under specific conditions. Heat, atmospheric layering, and the vast openness of the desert may also shape how signals behave from one hour to the next. That does not make the place supernatural, but it does make it complex, and complexity is often enough to generate legend. What is most revealing about the zone of silence may not be the equipment that fails, but the human response to failure. We are so accustomed to invisible networks carrying our voices that when those networks waver, the world feels suddenly older. The desert becomes less a backdrop than a force. Distance regains its weight. Isolation becomes physical again. Perhaps that is why the place endures in memory. It confronts a modern mind with an ancient feeling. To stand in a vast open space and realize that the world is under no obligation to carry your message. In that moment, silence is no longer empty. It becomes a presence of its own, asking whether connection is something we control or something we are merely lucky to have. What can the ground hide in plain sight until only the sky reveals it? In the Western Sahara, there is a formation so immense that a person standing inside it might notice almost nothing at all. But from orbit, it looks like the planet has opened an eye. This is the Richat Structure of Mauritania, often called the Eye of Africa. It stretches across the desert in vast concentric rings, a circular design nearly impossible to grasp from ground level. Rock, sand, and light arrange themselves into nested bands that seem almost intentional, as if some ancient geometry had been laid down and then weathered into permanence. Pilots and astronauts describe it as one of the most striking natural forms on Earth. From above, it does not merely occupy the landscape, it appears to observe it. When the formation first drew scientific attention, many assumed it must be the scar of an impact, the remnant of a cosmic collision. The shape seemed too symmetrical, too commanding, too complete to have emerged slowly, but closer study found no decisive signs of a meteor crater. Instead, geologists proposed a longer, quieter origin, a dome of rock lifted upward over immense spans of time, then worn down by erosion layer by layer until the circular bands emerged. In this account, the eye is not the mark of a sudden catastrophe, but of patience measured in millions of years. That explanation is compelling, yet the feeling of the place exceeds explanation. Archaeological traces around the structure suggest that human beings passed through this region for ages, leaving tools and fragments of life behind. The center, however, remains curiously sparse compared to its outer reaches, adding another subtle note to the desert's reserve. It is not proof of anything mystical, but it does reinforce the sensation that some landscapes shape human behavior long before they are understood. The Richat structure invites a humbling reversal. We are used to examining the world from the ground, piece by piece, building knowledge from what we can touch. But some truths do not emerge at that scale. They require distance. They require perspective. Only then does the pattern become visible. Perhaps that is why this place stays with us. Not simply because it is beautiful, but because it reminds us that meaning is sometimes too large to be seen from inside it. We spend much of life standing on fragments, unaware of the design beneath our feet, until one day some change in altitude, time, or understanding lets the hidden shape come into view. How do people create an image they were never meant to see all at once? In the desert of southern Peru, that question has been resting beneath sun and wind for more than 1,000 years. The Nazca lines lie across a broad coastal plain, drawn into the reddish surface by removing dark stones to reveal paler earth beneath. From the ground, they are almost impossible to comprehend. A straight line may feel like a path. A curve may seem accidental. A figure dissolves into fragments beneath your feet. But rise into the air, and the scattered marks gather themselves into astonishing forms. A hummingbird suspended in stillness, a monkey curled into motion, a spider stretched with quiet precision, along with geometric lines and shapes that extend across the desert like thoughts too large for a single human vantage point. We know who made them. The Nazca culture flourished here long before flight, long before drones and survey planes turned the sky into a platform for understanding. And that is what keeps the mystery alive. However they planned these figures, they committed enormous labor to forms they could never fully witness from above. Stakes and cord, grids, and measured distances may explain the method. Small models could have been expanded with remarkable discipline. None of this is impossible. But possibility is not the same as emotional resolution. The lines still feel like evidence of a perspective humans did not physically possess. So the question turns from how to why. Some researchers interpret the lines as ceremonial pathways, routes walked during ritual acts tied to water, fertility, and the sacred demands of an arid land. Others see astronomical alignments in certain lines, traces of a people who linked heaven and earth through observation. Many of the figures may have held meanings now lost, part of a symbolic world that survived in form but not in translation. That may be the most haunting part. Not that the lines are hidden, but that they are visible without being fully readable. They endure like a message whose language has faded while the letters remain sharp. We stand above them now and believe altitude should give us understanding. Yet seeing is not the same as knowing. Perhaps the Nazca lines ask something larger of us, not simply admiration for ancient skill, but humility before intention. Human beings have always made things for eyes beyond their own, for possibilities, for descendants, for memory, for the hope that someone someday might look from a different height and understand what they were trying to say. What do these places really give us when the answers remain incomplete? Not proof of the supernatural, not a permission slip for fantasy, something more durable than that. They return us to the discipline of wonder. By now, the pattern begins to emerge. A flame burns where water falls. Stones travel without witnesses. A river vanishes into rock. A desert boulder seems cut with impossible precision. Lights appear in a Norwegian valley, measured yet unnamed. Lightning turns a Venezuelan sky into a recurring cathedral of fire. The Pacific keeps its disappearances. A Mexican desert unsettles the tools we trust. A ring structure in the Sahara reveals itself only from far above. And in Peru, drawings larger than comprehension wait for a vantage point their makers never possessed. Each place begins as a mystery in the ordinary sense. A question, an anomaly, a scene that does not fit cleanly into expectation. But after a while, another layer becomes visible. These are also stories about method, about what human beings do when confronted with uncertainty. We observe, we compare, we invent instruments, we argue, we test, we return, we correct ourselves. Sometimes the answer sharpens, sometimes it widens. In either case, the search changes us. That may be the hidden thread connecting all of these landscapes. They are mirrors for the mind that studies them. They reveal our impatience, our imagination, our hunger for finality. We want the world to settle into a clean narrative because stories help us feel at home. Yet the deepest truths often resist that comfort. They arrive in fragments, provisional models, competing interpretations, and quiet revisions that ask us to live without closure a little longer. There is dignity in that. To admit uncertainty is not weakness. It is one of the most mature forms of attention. It means we are still listening closely enough to reality to let it disagree with us. So perhaps the real mystery is not why such places exist. The earth has always been inventive. The stranger question is why mystery disturbs us so deeply. Maybe because it interrupts the illusion that knowledge is possession. Maybe because it reminds us that understanding is not the same as control. Or maybe because beneath all inquiry, we recognize something personal in these unsolved spaces. They resemble memory itself, partial, vivid, and always larger than the story we tell about it. What remains after explanation has done it all it can. Not emptiness, not disappointment, something quieter and in many ways more enduring, a different relationship with the world. We often imagine discovery as a kind of conquest. A thing is unknown, then known. A blank space is filled. A mystery is solved and therefore finished. But the places in this journey suggest another model. Sometimes to understand a phenomenon is not to shrink it, but to place it within a larger field of meaning. The moving stones of Death Valley become no less beautiful because ice and wind help guide them. The lightning over Lake Maracaibo does not lose its majesty because meteorology can describe part of its rhythm. Explanation at its best is not a curtain drawn across wonder. It is a deeper invitation into it. And yet some questions remain stubborn, not because the world is withholding truth out of malice, but because truth unfolds unevenly. Evidence survives in fragments. Landscapes change. Cultures vanish. Languages disappear. Instruments improve, but not all at once. Human attention itself moves in cycles, drawn to one mystery while another waits in silence. What we call an unsolved place is often simply a place where time, matter, and memory have not yielded the whole story. There is something profoundly human in continuing anyway. To return to a valley for another night of observation. To revisit a desert line with new methods and old humility. To stand beside a waterfall flame or a vanished river and accept that curiosity does not require immediate reward. In that persistence, knowledge becomes less a collection of answers than a form of care. Maybe that is why these landscapes matter beyond their strangeness. They train the imagination without severing it from evidence. They allow awe and discipline to live in the same room. And in an age that rewards certainty, they remind us that some of the most honest sentences ever spoken begin with simple words. We do not yet know. That phrase is not an ending. It is a threshold, a way of keeping the mind open without letting it drift, a way of honoring reality by refusing to make it smaller than it is. And perhaps that, more than any solution, is what these places have been offering all along. Not answers alone, but a wiser way to ask. In the end, what do we really mean when we call a place mysterious? Perhaps not that it is unreachable or cursed or beyond reason. Perhaps we mean that it meets us at the edge of what we can currently hold and asks us to stay there a little longer. The world is full of locations that seem, at first glance, to defy explanation. But what lingers after this journey is not defiance. It is humility. A flame behind a waterfall, a stone crossing a silent playa, a river folding into darkness, a clean split in desert rock, lights over a northern valley, storms that return to the same sky, seas that keep their losses, deserts that interfere with our signals, rings too vast to perceive from the ground, lines drawn for a view beyond human reach. Each one reminds us that reality is not exhausted by our first description of it, and that may be the deeper comfort hidden inside mystery. We live in a time that often mistakes access for understanding. We can map, scan, model, and archive more of the planet than any generation before us. Yet the act of measuring a thing does not complete our relationship to it. Some truths need time. Some require context that history has misplaced. Some may always remain partly veiled, not because they are unknowable in principle, but because knowledge is a living process shaped by patience, imagination, and the willingness to be corrected. The people who first stood before these places did what we still do now. They looked. They wondered. They built stories large enough to contain what they felt. In that sense, mystery is not the opposite of knowledge. It is one of knowledge's oldest companions. It keeps inquiry alive. It protects us from arrogance. It reminds us that to be human is not only to answer questions, but to be formed by them. So perhaps the final lesson is this. The earth does not owe us full disclosure, and yet it keeps offering signs, patterns, glimpses, and unfinished sentences written in water, stone, weather, and light. Our task is not to force them into certainty before they are ready. It is to meet them with rigor, with wonder, and with the rare maturity to say that what remains unexplained is not empty. It is where the future of understanding begins.